They never meant for you to hear this. Not because it's false, but because once you do, you can't go back. Somewhere beneath the polite version of history you were fed, there's a story so quiet, so carefully buried, that even whispering it feels like trespassing on sacred ground. She was just a girl, not powerful, not chosen, or weak. They don't resist because they mistake it for safety. Her family had served institutions you've been taught to trust, not as employees but as architects. They understood that power doesn't sit on thrones anymore. It hides in systems, education systems that reward compliance, financial systems that punish independence, media systems that train emotion instead of thought. And then came the most dangerous lesson of all. Identity is programmable. They explained how collective trauma is cultivated and recycled, how entire populations can be guided by unresolved fear, passed down like genetic code. Wars weren't just fought for land, they were used to reset psychological baselines. Crashes weren't accidents, they were recalibrations. Outrage wasn't spontaneous, it was scheduled. She learned that normal is not natural. It's curated. Her family kept archives of moments when history could have gone another way, moments quietly redirected by unseen hands. Leaders who rose too independently and were neutralized without violence. Movements that threatened sovereignty of the inner self and were diluted, commercialized, then laughed at. Truths released slowly, distorted just enough to be dismissed by those who sensed them. The most unsettling part wasn't the knowledge itself. It was how familiar it felt. Deep down, she had always sensed something was off, that the world spoke in contradictions, that freedom was promised but never delivered. Her family didn't erase that instinct, they refined it. They taught her how to recognize awakening minds, and how institutions are designed to exhaust them before they organize. She was told this wasn't evil. That's how they justify it. They framed it as stewardship, as order, as protecting humanity from itself. Because chaos, they said, is what happens when men realize how powerful they truly are. That's when she understood the role she was being groomed for. Not a ruler, not a public figure, a stabilizer, someone who could enter systems unnoticed, someone who could redirect narratives with a sentence, a delay, a subtle omission, someone trained to suppress truth not by force, but by making it unbelievable. And here's the part that should unsettle you. If this knowledge feels uncomfortably close to reality, it's because you were never meant to be completely asleep. You were meant to doubt, just not enough to wake up. By the time she understood what her family truly was, it was already too late to leave, because the deeper truth wasn't that they manipulated systems. It was that the systems had begun to manipulate her. Every lesson came with a cost. Every revelation carved something out of her that could never be restored. Innocence wasn't taken violently. It was replaced, swapped for clarity so sharp it cut her every time she looked at the world. They taught her about ancient corruption, not as myth, but as continuity. Long before modern governments, before flags and constitutions, were learned its most effective disguise, morality. Her family traced their role back to priesthoods, courts, councils that never appeared in official records. When empires fell, they didn't mourn, they migrated. When religions fractured, they preserved the techniques, not the beliefs. The rituals were never about gods. They were about obedience, guilt, and delayed salvation, the perfect formula for control. She learned how fear of punishment evolved into fear of exclusion, how exile became unemployment, how heresy became misinformation. Same mechanism, new language, and then they showed her the archives no one else was allowed to see, not books, outcomes, timelines where men had nearly broken free. Moments when populations stood on the edge of self-mastery, only to be pulled back by distraction, division, or manufactured despair. She saw how masculinity itself had been slowly reframed. Strength labeled as danger, discipline recast as obsession, independence portrayed as selfishness not by accident, because men who master themselves become impossible to manage. Her family understood that true rebellion doesn't start with riots, it starts with internal sovereignty. So they helped design a world where men are busy, exhausted, medicated, entertained, and subtly ashamed of their own instincts. A world where intuition is drowned out by noise, where rage is redirected sideways instead of upward. She was trained to recognize the moment a man begins to wake up. The questions come first, then isolation, then self-doubt, then collapse. Unless redirected, that was her function, not to destroy men, but to stall them, to introduce just enough confusion to delay transformation, to offer half-truths wrapped in comfort, to make awakening feel lonely, unstable, even dangerous. Because a man who believes he's alone will always retreat back into the herd. And here's the part no one warned her about. The more she played this role, the more she began to fracture. Because suppressed truth doesn't disappear. It metastasizes. She started seeing the cracks in the system she was sworn to protect, started noticing the men who refused to collapse, men who endured isolation and emerged sharper, calmer, uncontrollable, men like you. That's when she realized the real secret her family never spoke aloud. The system only works until enough men remember who they are. Halfway down the descent is where the pressure changes. This is where most people turn back. Not because they're afraid, but because something inside them starts to recognize itself, and recognition is dangerous. For her, this was the point where loyalty and truth could no longer coexist. She began to see the cost of the system in human terms, not statistics, faces, men hollowed out by quiet despair, families fractured by invisible stressors no one could name, boys punished for instincts they never chose, then medicated for reacting exactly as expected. The system called it progress. Our family called it stability. But she saw it for what it was. Managed decline. And the most disturbing realization wasn't that people were controlled. It was that many of them defended their cage. She watched how the system trained people to mock anything that hinted at deeper power. Ancient wisdom was labeled superstition. Self-mastery was framed as extremism. Brotherhood was suspicious. Silence was weakness unless sanctioned. The moment a man stepped outside the approved narrative, the system didn't attack him directly. It isolated him, made him question his sanity, turned his own friends into enforcers. Her family had a name for this phase, the soft kill. No blood, no martyrs, just erosion. And then she understood why her initiation had happened so young. Because once empathy fully matures, this work becomes unbearable. Children adapt, adults resist. That's the unspoken rule of institutional corruption. Recruit before conscience stabilizes. But something had gone wrong. She started dreaming. Not fantasies, but memories that weren't hers. Echoes of older worlds where men lived by codes instead of permissions, where identity wasn't negotiated, where power flowed inward before it ever touched the external world. These dreams weren't taught. They surfaced on their own, like buried instincts reclaiming ground. That terrified her family. Because instincts can't be legislated. They warned her that curiosity was the first symptom of treason, that empathy was a liability, that questioning the system meant aligning with chaos. But their voices had lost authority. Once you see the machinery, you can't pretend the noise is music, and this is where I need you to do something, not for engagement, but for alignment. If this is resonating, if something in you feels activated rather than entertained, comment the phrase, I remember, twice, I remember, not because it changes the algorithm, because it changes you. Language anchors identity, repetition locks it in. This is how the system has always worked, and how you reverse it. She knew the risk the moment she crossed that internal line. Once you stop serving suppression, you become a liability, and liabilities don't get second chances. From this point forward, her story stops being about survival and starts being about defiance. Defiance doesn't announce itself with noise. It begins as stillness. After that internal line was crossed, her behavior didn't change on the surface. That's the mistake people make when they imagine rebellion. They expect fire, rage, exposure, but real defiance inside corrupted systems looks like obedience perfected, just misaligned enough to rot the structure from within. She continued her role, but something subtle shifted. She stopped stalling the men who were waking up. She stopped redirecting their questions toward comfort. Instead, she learned when to step aside, when to say nothing, when to allow silence to do the work she was trained to interrupt. Silence is lethal to manipulation. Her family had always taught her that chaos must be managed early before it coheres. But what they never admitted is that coherence is not chaos. It's emergence. And emergence terrifies systems built on fragmentation. She began tracing the deeper layers of control they never spoke about openly. Not institutions, not media, not money, but time, attention, exhaustion. She realized the modern system doesn't just occupy men's bodies, it colonizes their future. It keeps them perpetually behind bills, behind expectations, behind shame, so they never gain the psychological altitude required to see the whole map. That's why rest is discouraged, why stillness is pathologized, why reflection is framed as laziness unless monetized. She saw how men who reclaimed their mornings reclaimed their minds, how discipline rebuilt intuition, how physical mastery reawakened moral clarity. None of this was mystical. It was biological, neurological, ancient, and it was being suppressed on purpose. The system doesn't fear angry men, it fears integrated men. Men whose thoughts, bodies, and values are aligned cannot be predictably controlled. They don't respond to manufactured outrage. They don't fracture under shame. They don't outsource authority to institutions that haven't earned it. Her family had contingency plans for riots. They map. They wait to see if awareness spreads. Her family called this phase containment. Not arrests, not exposure, just narrowing options. Careers that stall for no reason. Relationships strained by artificial stress. Narratives seated around a man's character before he even speaks. The goal isn't to destroy him, it's to exhaust him into self-censorship. She had helped design this, and now she was watching it deployed against men who had done nothing wrong except remember themselves. That's when the final illusion shattered. The system didn't hate these men. It needed them broken, because every civilization rests on a small percentage of men who carry disproportionate psychological load. Men who stabilize families. Men who anchor values. Men who don't outsource meaning. When those men are disoriented, the entire structure becomes easier to steer. This was the ancient corruption at its core, not evil for pleasure, but control for continuity. She realized something else her family never admitted. The system is old, but it is tired. It relies on inertia, on men choosing comfort over coherence, on the belief that resistance must be loud to matter. It cannot adapt quickly to discipline, silence, or internal order. That's why it floods the world with noise, why every screen competes for your attention, why outrage is constant, why stillness feels almost illegal. A man who can sit alone with his thoughts without panic becomes unreadable, and unreadable men can't be predicted. She stopped asking how to dismantle the system. That's a trap. You don't dismantle it, you outgrow it. The moment enough men withdraw psychological consent, not publicly, not performatively, but internally, the system loses leverage. It can punish behavior. It cannot punish alignment. It can confiscate resources. It cannot confiscate discipline. Her family had no protocol for that. And here's the truth you're meant to hear right now, even if it makes you uncomfortable. You don't need secret bloodlines. You don't need access. You don't need permission. Everything they guard externally is a substitute for what they fear internally. A man who governs himself. That's why this knowledge is framed as dangerous, not because it's violent, because it's irreversible. She knew the cost the moment she fully stepped out of alignment with her lineage. She would lose protection, status, safety. She would become invisible to those who once elevated her, and visible to forces that prefer shadows. But she also knew this: a system that depends on suppression collapses. The moment suppression fails quietly, and silence, when chosen consciously, is not absence. It's power held in reserve. This is where the story stops being about her, because what happened next was never meant to be recorded. Only felt. She didn't expose her family. She didn't publish names. She didn't burn institutions to the ground. That would have been predictable, and therefore manageable. Instead, she vanished from relevance. No scandals, no dramatic fall. Just a quiet withdrawal from the mechanism she once served. To the system, she became unremarkable. And that's the most dangerous thing you can be, because power only monitors what it can categorize. Her family interpreted her withdrawal as weakness, as burnout, as failure to carry the weight of legacy. They replaced her quickly, another child, another mind shaped early enough to obey before questioning. The lineage continued. The machine kept humming, but something had already changed. The men she didn't stall went on to build discipline instead of outrage, structure instead of rebellion, brotherhood instead of spectacle. Small circles, no leaders, no flags, no slogans to infiltrate or corrupt, just men refining themselves until their presence stabilized everything around them. This is how forbidden history actually moves, not through revolutions, through standards. Empires don't fall when they're attacked. They decay when they can no longer shape the men within them. When the stories stop working, when shame loses its grip, when fear is recognized as a tool instead of a truth. Her family never believed that would happen. That was their blind spot. They thought control was permanent because it had always existed. They forgot that every system in history eventually overplays its hand. It extracts too much, pushes too hard, accelerates decay in the name of stability. And when that happens, the men who endured silently become the new constant. Here's what they never wanted you to realize. You are not late, you're early to a phase where power no longer announces itself, where dominance is internal, where identity is chosen, not assigned, where knowledge isn't hoarded, it's embodied. That's why this feels less like a story and more like a remembering, because nothing you've heard here is new, it's old, older than the institutions that taught you to doubt yourself, older than the narratives designed to keep you manageable, older than the fear that tells you awareness is dangerous. It is dangerous, but not to you, to anything that survives on your fragmentation. She was just a girl until her family's secret changed everything. You were just a man until you remembered what you are, and once a man remembers, truly remembers, there is no system on earth that can make him forget. The descent ends here. What you do with what you've recovered is entirely up to you.